Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for the launch of the 8th edition of the Good Merger Index. My name is Tracy O'Keefe, and I'm the Head of Partnerships and Mergers for Eastside Primetimers. We're delighted to welcome some 90-odd guests today. That's all coming in, so a sign perhaps of how important this issue is to the sector. Eastside has established its reputation as a leading advisor on merger and partnership working in the social sector, and the GMI is an annual piece of research that we carry out to shed light on merger activity and so inform our work. We're delighted to be able to share the highlights with you today, and we will be sending on a copy of the report to you after the webinar together with a copy of the slides, so no need to take extensive notes. If you have joined via Zoom latterly today rather than the Eventbrite link, then please do drop me an email. My email details will be here again later, just to ensure that you receive those and we've captured your email address. So first of all, a few housekeeping points. The webinar will be recorded today and will be available from the Eastside website after the event. Please use the Q&A channel to ask any questions. You can ask questions anonymously, so please don't hold back and please don't be scared to ask the dumb question. It's always the important one. And there will be an opportunity to ask questions both after the initial presentation and then later after the panel session which follows. But if you have a burning question along the way, please do drop it into the Q&A and we will do our best to feed it in as appropriate. We will be tweeting live from the event, so please feel free to do the same. We're using the hashtag Good Merger Index, and our Twitter handle is here. It's at @EP_insights. If you're having any technical problems at all, please post this in the chat channel, because we'll be watching that and we'll do whatever we can do to help. So on with the webinar. I'm joined today by Mike Taylor, an Eastside colleague. Mike, please wave. There we go, who is actually the author of the report, and he will be taking us through the findings shortly and answering any specific questions on the research that you'd like to raise at the end of the presentation. Following Mike's presentation, there will be a panel discussion led by Eastside's Chief Executive, Richard Litchfield. Hi, Richard. And he will be joined by our sector leaders who will be sharing with you their experience of merger and wider partnership working. So I'm going to introduce those panelists now. So please wave, guys, as I come to you. So first of all, Sarah Hillier is the Chief Executive of Northamptonshire Mind, formed in 2020 by the merger of 4 independent local mind charities. Sarah will share her experience of being appointed as CEO to the new organisation and her reflections on a journey which has seen Northamptonshire Mind become the largest third sector mental health service provider in the county, providing services, advocacy and training for mental health professionals. Next, we have David Webster. Hi, David, who is the Chief Executive of Douglas Macmillan, or fondly known as Dougie Mac Hospice, which serves 3,500 people with life-limiting illnesses, their families and carers in Stoke-on-Trent and North Staffordshire. In 2021, David completed the amalgamation of local children's hospice, the Donna Louise Trust, into Dougie Mac, and he'll be sharing his experience of conducting a merger during the pandemic, how merger must be driven by strategic focus, the key role for boards, and when a strategic alliance may prove a better vehicle for collaboration than merger. Next, we have Chris Wright. Good afternoon, Chris, who is the Chief Executive of Catch-22, the social business driving public service reform across justice, education, employment and family support in the UK. Chris leads a team of 1,800 staff and volunteers that support over 100,000 people nationally. Chris is a firm advocate of more consolidation among charities and social enterprises to drive more resources to beneficiaries. And he will share his experiences of merger, demerger, partnerships and strategic alliances, the benefits and the potential pitfalls to avoid. And last but not least is Clive. Clive Vergnaud is a senior associate in legal firm Stone Kings charity and social enterprise team. And he advises charities, social enterprises and purpose-led businesses to help them achieve greater impact. Clive will be sharing his experience and insights gained from working across the sector in supporting mergers and collaborations, including formations, funding and regulatory changes. But before we get into the panel discussion, let's first hear from Mike about what this year's research has told us about merger activity in the sector. Over to you, Mike.
I'm going to spend 10 minutes talking about our research into mergers in the year 2020 to 21. Starting with a little bit of history, we've been undertaking the GMI for 8 years now, which has given us a good baseline of data. We tend to look at 1 year compared to the previous year, but this time we wanted to look at the trends across all 8 years, especially given the impact of COVID on the year in question. Of course, there was a lot of concern about how the pandemic might impact the sector, fears that we would see a lot of organisations close, and also that we might have seen a lot more mergers, and we'll come to that later. I want to start by giving some context to what information is out there about mergers. There's no definitive record of merger activity across the whole not-for-profit sector. The Charity Commission does publish a register of mergers, but this has its limitations. Of course, it only reflects activity in registered charities. Crucially, it only lists a merger where a charity has closed. In many mergers, there is no charity closure because of the requirement to keep a charity there to receive legacies. A merger is only listed once it's registered with the Charity Commission, and it can take many years for this to happen. Overall, we don't get much information from the Register of Mergers. Essentially, it tells us when the assets of a charity were transferred to another. And this register contains a great many reorganisations and what we might call administrative changes, such as the closure of a charitable company as it converts into a CIO, or the consolidation of funds into a larger parent organisation. Nevertheless, if we simply look at mergers in the register, we do see something interesting. Perhaps something is going on, but we really need to look a lot harder to understand what's really going on. In terms of our methodology, our merger year runs from May to April. This is because a lot of mergers take place in April, and by running our year as such, it means we capture those April mergers much sooner rather than waiting another year. We get all our data from the Charity Commission register, web searches, we monitor public announcements, and then we delve deeper, very often looking into annual reports and statutory accounts. And we continue to pick up mergers for several months after the year end. We look for mergers of charities and other social enterprises. And we date the timing of the merger when we can best judge it to be meaningfully complete based on the information we can glean. So in the absence of a clear date from the Charity Commission register, we might use a date for when the new charity operates as one. Finally, I should add that we use our own definitions for merger types, which are detailed in the report. Most mergers are either takeovers or mergers of equals. I should emphasise that we're looking at this from a very technical point of view. What we may see as a takeover may not be felt to be such a thing for those involved. And when we say takeover, we don't mean that as a pejorative term. We mean that the assets of one organisation have been transferred to another and that the organisation is effectively closed, even if the brand remains active. Okay, now looking into what we've observed. It certainly looks as if merger activity is rising. Just a note, since many mergers involve more than two organisations, we see more organisations involved than we might first expect. We can see there appears to be a trend, but not a clear shift for COVID. Anecdotally, the sector generally has been reporting no significant increase in mergers. But what's observed by professional advisors and consultants may be more likely to reflect activity in larger organisations and more complex mergers. More straightforward mergers involving smaller organisations could be slipping under the radar. Indeed, when we look at this, we see that the increase in activity is driven only by smaller organisations, which is really interesting. Activity in organisations larger than 1 million turnover has stagnated or declined in the past 3 years. At this point, it's perhaps useful to try and understand the nature of these mergers a bit more. One of the ways we do this is to assess the financial value of mergers. We don't look at assets transferred. For many organisations, assets aren't reported. And more importantly, the assets don't always correlate so well with the amount of charitable activity. This isn't an exact science, but we instead use income to assess the value or size of a merger. For a merger of equals, we add the incomes of the organisations involved. For a takeover or similar types of merger, we just use the income of the organisations that are being transferred. Important to note, we use the figures for the year prior to merger, as the merger year can distort finances considerably. Therefore, even more importantly, this means that for most of the mergers, not all, in the year 2021, the financials are from the year to March 2020, so not impacted by COVID. When we look at the value of income transferred, we do see something that might be COVID related. This graph shows two things. First, on the left scale and the blue line, we see the combined income of all organisations involved in merger. And it's been relatively low for the past few years. This perhaps correlates with the reduced number of larger organisations being active in merger, and it would not take very many large organisations to shift this figure further. But what appears to be very stark is the significant drop in the value of income transferred. At first, this seems a little counterintuitive, since we're seeing more mergers and the total income of all organisations hasn't shifted at the same time. This next slide perhaps explains what's happening here. What we see here is that the number of takeovers is at an all-time high as far as the GMI is concerned. At the same time, the number of mergers of equals is down on last year. If we consider the multiplying effect of this, with a reduction in the number of larger organisations involved, then we begin to see that overall we're getting a drop in merger activity between larger organisations, specifically the merger of equals or more complex mergers of larger organisations. In the meantime, we're seeing more activity involving takeover of smaller organisations. This next slide perhaps summarises the impact of these two intersecting factors. When we look at the relative mix of organisation size and organisation type, we can see how this is a reflection of fewer larger complex mergers and more straightforward takeovers of smaller organisations. And just to reflect on the top mergers by size, in the GMI report we list the top 20 mergers by income transferred, and you'll be able to download that soon. If we look at just the top 3, we can see the trends we've discussed illustrated. In the year 20 to 21, the value of the top 3 mergers by income transferred is 33 million, down from 88 million in the previous year. We can clearly see here how even in the top 3, the size of organisations involved and the type of merger impacts on the overall value of income transferred. And just to make a mention of the financial conditions that form a context for any merger, every year we look at the proportion of organisations in surplus or deficit in the year prior to merger. We know that typically transferring organisations, those being taken over or forming a merger of equals, tend to be more likely to be in deficit. Conversely, we know that receiving organisations tend to be more likely to be in surplus. This year we see that this remains true. However, a much smaller proportion of receiving organisations or transferees are in surplus, and the proportion of transferring organisations in deficit is greater than the past 2 years. this seems to indicate an environment of increased financial stress. But as mentioned, it's important to note that most, not all, of these figures relate to the year before COVID. What we also know is that it's far better for an organisation to seek merger before it finds itself in financial difficulty. If we do seek merger before this difficulty arises, it's more likely to result in a merger of equals, or at least one where there's more collaboration rather than compromise. Mergers of equals are more complex and perhaps more protracted, although arguably with a better outcome for all concerned. It'll be really interesting to see how the pattern continues in the following year, when we'll be looking at accounts that have been impacted much more by COVID. So I'm going to finish with a few key outtakes and look forward to hearing the thoughts of the panel and your thoughts on the information that we've seen and what might be going on and might yet be to be discovered. More takeovers with more smaller organisations involved. Fewer mergers of equals, particularly involving larger organisations. More financial stress. But some trends emerging pre-COVID. Perhaps the one thing we can see is this decline or hiatus in the more complex mergers of equals amongst larger organisations. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. No questions in the Q&A at the moment, so shall we crack on, Tracy?
Yes, I think we will. Let's come back to those if we want to pick up any specific points from the research. But thank you very much, Mike, and thank you for all the work in producing the report. It does make a really good read, and with all the case studies involved as well. So over to the panel discussion, and so we plan to cover a number of topics now. Again, put your questions in the Q&A. We'll probably go through our discussion themes, and if there's something specific, I'll throw it in. If not, we'll come back to it at the end. So I'll hand over to Richard now, and we'll get on with our discussion.
Great. Thank you, Tracy, and thanks, Mike, for presenting the report. So I get the fun bit here, which is now to kind of delve into the detail and to bring our panel into discussion and a debate about some of, well, really their personal experiences about mergers and collaborations that they've been involved in. So yeah, let's make a start. So I think we've probably done the bios, haven't we, at the start of the meeting, so we don't need to do that again, but maybe I will set the scene in this way. So of our panelists, Clive, David, Sarah and Chris, we have two panel members have been leading their organisations through merger of one kind or another. That's David and Sarah in the last 12 months. We have Clive joining us from Stone King, partners of EP, and Clive's going to be able to give us a bit of I guess a macro perspective and also a technical one. So if there are questions or kind of issues we want to jump into around the legal side of doing these kind of projects, then Clive's our man. And then we've got Chris, who has not featured himself, or his organisation hasn't featured in the GMI this year specifically, but has done it in the past and has done many different mergers and collaborations over the years. And I kind of see Chris as I guess a bit of an ally walking the same kind of journey as us, and in the sense that Chris has spoken about collaboration and consolidation, and I think probably without preempting what we're all going to say, but we'll have a similar take to EP on its merits. So I'm grateful, guys, for you all joining. Tracy, I see you've got a hand up. Have we got some questions you want to?
Yeah, there's just one that probably relates, and maybe the panel want to reflect before we get into the themes. So Brent is asking whether there's any evidence that smaller organisations are shunning merger approaches from larger organisations, or that larger organisations are not interested in taking over smaller organisations. So I just wondered, with the panel's experience, whether they might want to wrap that into their responses.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's grand. So So the first theme that we're going to cover is I'd like us to kind of take have a moment to reflect on those on the GMI findings and to have a bit of a macro kind of view here on to what extent the findings here resonate with panel members. And I think, Clive, I'm going to bring you in first. You're like ourselves in professional services, so you see probably across the sector. So a question to you here would be, could you just talk about to what extent the findings here resonate with what you're seeing in the sector at the moment, or not?
Of course, Richard, thank you. I'd be delighted to, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I must admit I feel a little bit out of place on the panel with CEOs of sort of successful charities that have sort of gone through this in person. And the legal part is an important bit, but it's such a small part of the larger puzzle that leaders of charities that are emerging need to go through. But hopefully I can give some of that sort of cross-sector insight. Stone King is a law firm that has a focus on working with organizations and individuals that have public benefit baked into their operating model. So charities, social enterprises, impact businesses, social investors, philanthropists, etc. And so in that capacity, we find ourselves doing a lot of work advising charities on the specificities of charity law and regulation, and a big chunk of that is big transactions between charities, collaborations, mergers, restructures, etc. And I think when the pandemic hit, we sort of stepped back for a moment and thought, probably we're going to be seeing in the short to medium term a marked increase in a couple of work streams or at least the queries coming our way. And we thought we'd see an increase in closures, charity closures, and we thought we'd see an increase in the number of charity mergers as well. And our guess, our thinking was that those mergers, and again, this is at the outset, would be mostly driven by financial necessity, the sort of financial rescue type model, than the kind of mergers that we see when it's two equal organizations coming together and planning strategically for the future. And actually, maybe as you did at Eastside Primetimers, Richard and Mike and Tracy, we felt that was a bit of a shame, because we felt there'd been a bit of an increase, or the idea that considering mergers as part of your normal strategic planning as one of many ways in which an organization can grow and diversify their services and reach more beneficiaries and provide better services was beginning to gain traction. And we thought that it would be a shame if there was a sort of a reversion to sort of the seeing merger only as a last resort type thing. But that's a bit of an aside. So we were expecting an increase in that merger of activity, and then actually in the past 2 years we haven't really observed that. We've definitely seen an increase in closures. We've seen an increase in charities setting off assets to raise funds, refocusing their activities, perhaps reprioritizing certain services that they felt were more critically needed, reorganizing themselves to respond. But we didn't actually see an increase in mergers. So I put out a short piece saying, well, why aren't we seeing more charity mergers? And Mike, who I've known for a few years, got in touch and said, aha, I've done the research. I have more than just your anecdotal experience, and I might have an answer with you. So we started chatting, and I mean, I think there's the points that Mike was making about there being a larger proportion of mergers carried out by smaller organizations on a takeover model. I think is consistent with what we've seen anecdotally, and I think this possibly ties in with the question that was asked in the Tracy that you conveyed earlier on. Actually, I think the pandemic focused minds a little bit, possibly at trustee level and among senior leadership teams. And actually, the financial pressures were such that there would have been, I'm sure there were a number of charities that needed to consider merger, but just actually didn't have the resources available to pay for advisors. And so our experience in working in a law firm is that, well, we we get some inquiries, but the experience that we have of working on those jobs is inevitably when there is funds available to pay for that advice. But I think the context of the pandemic focused minds. I think possibly it emboldened trustees and leadership teams to do the things that they might not otherwise have felt that they could do without external advice. We definitely saw trustee boards being less cautious and taking more of a risk-based approach to decision making, which is healthy, I think, in those types of circumstances, and also making use of free resources, bringing trustees on board who are willing to engage time and energy, maybe rather than working with advisors where those resources weren't available. I think what was also quite unique circumstance was that there was a spell of the Charity Commission, who was an important part of merger work. It frequently, it's usually the case that at some stage you need to involve the Commission for some form of consent or authority. And whereas traditionally perhaps the Commission is slightly cautious itself in helping charities in this work, during the pandemic, the Commission was exceptionally helpful, really went into a we can help mindset, responded more quickly to pandemic related queries, including around mergers. And so maybe that helped facilitate things as well. On the question about whether bigger charities are maybe keeping away from taking over little charities, our experience of working with a number of mature, large mature charities that have developed merger activity as a growth strategy is actually that no, not at all, but they have simply developed that sort of in-house expertise, where actually they don't necessarily need to come to us to carry out their normal merger growth activities, except in the difficult scenarios. So I think the fact that we haven't experienced it personally is maybe sort of reflective of those findings in the report. Maybe some other points I think of what we've experienced is, as I said, a lot of closures, but a lot of sort of internal restructurings and rationalization of endowment funds, tapping into permanent endowment, de-restricting funds, doing that either with the consent of funders or with the consent of the Charity Commission, basically thinking creatively about the funds that are available and moving them around to the extent that that's possible. But clearly what we've seen a lot less of is those large complex mergers that sort of are the result of strategic planning over years. I think there were some of those in the pipeline and those have been put on hold. And I think that's probably just a result of fewer organizations and fewer individuals having the brain space to engage with those projects, because they're so focused on the immediate need of their beneficiaries. And you need many things to come together for a successful merger. And I think possibly that the environment wasn't quite right and maybe isn't yet quite right for that as we just begin to come out of the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks, Clive. Look, there's loads in that, and I think really interesting from my point of view, the point about the restructurings and those kind of the increases that you're seeing there, which are, you know, won't necessarily be, won't be picked up in the GMI specifically. So that's really interesting. I think it's interesting about the Charity Commission. I don't know, we might go there a bit later and get others' takes on that. Yeah, I'm just gonna dwell on the last point though, if I may, and with you and the panel, and this kind of observation that there are less merger of equals, large scale kind of transformative arrangements than maybe we've seen in the past. And you mentioned, I think, capacity, maybe senior capacity being, or the lack of senior capacity being perhaps a driver for that. Chris, can I kind of turn to you for your perspective on that same question? You know, you're running a larger organization, a large youth organization in the sector. I don't know whether, you know, you might not want to disclose too much about your strategic growth plan. So I don't know if this is really if you could answer this either from a catch-22 point of view, or perhaps just from the perspective of being in the same shoes as others, and interested on your view as why larger organisations don't seem to be as active in significant size mergers as they have been in past years.
Thanks, Richard, and it's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I was listening with interest to Clive's input, and just like to say that on every step of the journey we've been on, we've been accompanied by really good professional advisors, and Julian Blake from Clive's firm is the guy who I look to when it comes to conversations about mergers and consolidation. I think if I was really blunt on the point around larger charities and whether what's happening in that space, I think there's probably a lot at stake, and I'm not always sure that this might be a bit of a provocative point of view, but I'm not always sure that the interests of beneficiaries is the starting point of the conversation. I think there's a lot more political and historical and orthodoxy about maintaining what you've already got. Catch-22 itself is a product of two relatively large organisations coming together in 2008. So we kind of lived that experience. Occasionally I've had conversations with other organisations of similar size, and you get so far and then it kind of gets stuck for reasons which I don't always think are to do with how you improve service delivery. And I think it becomes quite, there's a lot of vested interest, and we have to, I think there's a real need for, you have to be really honest about this stuff. If you believe that consolidation is a good thing because it allows you to reach more of the beneficiaries you're trying to serve, then you've also got to be prepared to be part of the process of consolidation. And I think we don't always face up to that. And so sometimes, and I'm not excusing myself from this, I think you end up, the vested interest ends up kind of getting in the way of progress sometimes. But I might be being particularly provocative, but you could see some really good arguments for there's a lot of organizations of certain scale operating in the same space who even though they're relative scale, still don't have the size of balance sheet to carry some of the risk in order to cross procurement thresholds with government. And so if you really want to create an alternative social sector, alternative provider of public services, then I think there is an argument to say, hey, shouldn't we start to think about how we create a larger organization with greater balance sheet, with greater ability to take risk? But who knows?
Yeah, a lot of that resonates with me. And just on this point of has there been, whether there's been a reduction, I guess, in large organizations talking to large organizations essentially during COVID? I mean, is that something that you recognize? How would you read that one?
I mean, I can only speak from my experience. I think all of us through COVID have stopped talking to a lot of people because we've ended up having to transact on technological platforms like this. And I think a lot of those conversations tend to happen in the margins of other meetings. You get to know people. And I just wonder whether actually the constraints of the last couple of years have got in the way of being able to initiate some of those conversations.
Yeah. Makes sense. Tracy, I can see some questions coming in on the Q&A. Was there anything at this stage you wanted to feed in from our audience?
Yeah, there's a few that are coming in on kind of quite specific things. Perhaps one for Clive, whether we've seen any increase in takeovers where organisations have responsibility for property, particularly, whether that's something that you've noticed at all. That's from Sandra.
Not a noticeable increase in takeovers. No, I think it's more in that sort of area. It's more charities really seeing how they can maximise their assets, including obviously the value of assets like property, and I mean, trying to find creative ways of either generating revenue from that property to the extent that they can do without using it, or selling it off, and actually implementing some quite dramatic changes in the way they operate where that's possible as well.
And something we may touch on later, but just while I've got you, is around kind of whether we've seen forms of merger, I suppose, more sort of group structures or a new charities created, or sort of those approaches. But is that something we're going to pick up later in the discussion?
Yeah,
I think, isn't it?
Yeah, we'll come on to that actually. Let's deal with that a little bit later.
And we have others, and we will come to them. But I think it would be good in a way to let the flow of the conversation run, and then we'll come back to all of these at the end, if that's okay.
Great, thanks, Tracy. Yeah, so look, let's move on. And the next area I'd be keen to delve into is around the benefits and mergers, the benefits and motivations for mergers and other kinds of collaboration. And I guess that from what we've heard from Mike earlier in this meeting about the key themes of this year's GMI, one that clearly stands out is that we see how many local specialist organisations are finding new ways to collaborate, new ways to work together with others. So Sarah, I wanted to bring you into the discussion, and you find yourself in a very unique position, I think, in the sense of having taken over a merger that has been cooked and boiled up by others, and your job is now to unite and lead the new organisation. So I wondered if you could.
Can I just check? David put his hand up quite a few times in that last.
Oh, did he? Oh, sorry,
minutes.
David.
And I just want to check before I start my dramatic rambling that the point he was going to make, I didn't know if it was linked to the previous subject.
Yeah, look, thanks for raising that. Sorry, I missed that, David.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I appreciate that intervention. I just had a couple of remarks really in relation to the larger charities point. Firstly, that the last 12 months I've had more tickles from other large charities than in the previous 5 years. And that's as a result, I think, entirely of their merger appetite, as demonstrated by taking over the smaller children's hospice. So there's perhaps some things going on in the background that aren't yet apparent in the front. The second thing, which is perhaps a bit more structural, is that in my previous life, when I was in financial services, it would be a regulatory requirement for the regulator of the industry to identify organisations whose capital was effectively deteriorating over a period of time. And they would approach the boards and ask them exactly what they're doing about that before it came to a position where a rescue was required. So there is a flight path towards organisational change. And I'm not entirely sure that trustee boards and charities are quite adept at looking at that flight path. It's a whole lot better to put something together where you've still got some juice in the tank, rather than waiting until the mixing metaphors, the runway has gone and you've really not got a lot of options left. And that's often in other industries driven by regulatory attention. And I don't think that's the case in the charity sector. So a lot depends on trustees' ability to identify whether they are running out of runway or otherwise.
Yeah, thanks, David. Now that's grand, and yeah, that whole point I think also plays into the issue of kind of timing and when's the right time to explore merger. And I think you're right to point out that the Charity Commission, in terms of being a regulator, even in a year when it's to take Clive's phrase, been surprisingly helpful, is a very different kind of beast to regulators that we find in other sectors. Folks, I'm going to take us on to just talk more about benefits and motivation. So there may be some other points there, David, as well, that you were just touching on that we can bring into this part of the discussion.
That's probably quite helpful for the start of my bit.
Yeah,
really,
so Sarah, over to you. And if you could talk particularly about, just take us to the point of why your merger, what were like the benefits and the rationale that well, your colleagues, I guess your trustees, had identified. That'd be really interesting.
So you will be aware if you've read papers. If you haven't, very quick summary for local Mind. So Mind is a large national charity but operates kind of local delivery charities. So we have kind of an affiliated model, and there were within the county of Northamptonshire, there were 5 who have had conversations over a 10-year period around kind of the county-wide versus kind of districts and boroughs, as it were, say. And so I suppose what had happened was there were a number of discussions, as you've just described, David, where people were looking forward 3 or 4 years and thinking about both quality of provision, because I get very caught up in that. So I'm sad to hear, Chris, when you said that sometimes the beneficiaries and what we can spend on delivering services isn't always perhaps a priority. I completely acknowledge it. And I see it around the sector. But I think for us, it was very much around if we could consider what would be the sum of the parts, if that makes sense, kind of if we could come together and think about the fact that we have buildings within each of the local neighbourhoods, communities, districts, boroughs, but actually how could we think about streamlining and reducing some of those kinds of leadership and management costs? How could we ensure that what we were doing from a kind of executive level upwards gave us a much bigger, I would say, footprint within the county? We could, as a larger organisation, kind of embed ourselves within the architecture of the growing integrated care system. It was very much around trying to be able to put more resource into direct service delivery and have more clout, excuse the crassness. We've got within our county, we've got 2 kind of peacocking unitary authorities that are relatively new. We've got huge failures in some of both our children and adult services. We've seen quite a lot of change across our county, and I would say that the voluntary sector over the last 3 to 4 years have been the most stable part of delivery in social care and health. And so there was some real good foresight from the trustees. Not every, interestingly, within our county, 4 out of the 5 local charities decided to be a part of this merger and come together, and that was because they had a closer kind of delivery model. So at the point that I arrived, which was October 2020, we were in a position where the new board had formed. We had started all the legal processes. Clive, I roll my eyes because they've driven me mad. And even to this very day, there are still some small niggly details that are problematic. A random bank account will appear somewhere from 40 years ago. And so we're laughing because it's a pain. But I think that the benefits were sold strategically. And I think that now, 18 months on, our staff and our service users are really feeling those benefits. But it would be remiss of me not to talk about the struggle and the heartache and the loss, which we all like to kind of, we all like to have our head down and think about our motives are improving and increasing the quality of services, the amount of services, the training opportunities and the ability to kind of influence system change within your county, your region, whatever it might be. But actually for us, it was a kind of top-down process, and therefore we did experience some heartache and loss, I would say, from within leadership teams and also for some of our kind of longer term service users.
Great. Sarah, could you maybe give us a little bit more insight on the the heartache and loss? That feels like a war story, so that will no doubt be of interest.
I'm always really I'm quite happy. I'm quite happy to. But I get very caught up in the people and the journey for the people involved in these processes, which is why I was pleasantly surprised I was even asked to come, because I think that whilst everybody knew what the benefits were, it doesn't mean that it isn't painful for people going through that process. And Chris, I think it's what you were talking about and what you were alluding to. Sometimes in those leadership roles, you're making decisions that you know will change people's jobs, may even delete or mean jobs or roles might not exist. You're fundamentally asking people to flip on the head the way they've always done things. And whilst the pandemic was a good opportunity, I think, for people to really challenge themselves and reflect, you know, we have two schools of people within our organisation: those that see the pandemic as the great pause and a wonderful opportunity to grow and develop and reflect, and those that see it as a battleground. Literally, services, you know, the demand for services escalated, the kind of, you know, the needs that we were serving grew. You know, people who'd never experienced kind of, you know, mental health issues before suddenly were. And so we were trying to manage change at the same time as, you know, we all experienced the pandemic. It wasn't just our service users. So I think that was part of it. And we when I say lost and things, I'm referring perhaps to staff that maybe have got 20, 30 years experience, commitment and drive to our purpose. You know, they'd been with Mind for a long time.
Were there a lot of redundancies? Were there a lot of redundancies? Did you need to
No, we didn't have redundancies. There was lots of movement and change, and I think that's still ongoing now. We've moved people into positions and roles, and we have had the luxury of reviewing that every kind of 6 months. So there's one lady who's on her third post since we've kind of redesigned and reorganized, and what we're trying to do is take everybody with us. But there were people that literally, I mean, it's the wrong environment for me to stick a middle finger up, but that's how they felt. They felt quite aggrieved by the process, and that by becoming big, we were moving away from neighbourhood and community.
Sure. So
there was a challenge that, you know, are we becoming corporate?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what that means, but that was their general feeling.
Okay, interesting. Clive's got his hand up. Clive.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I just wanted to jump in really quickly, because what Sarah says resonates really strongly with sort of our experience of working with these kinds of in these kinds of pieces of work. I think there's a tendency, natural, I think, tendency to underestimate the amount of consultation work that is required. I think when I say consultation, I don't just mean ticking the boxes from an employment law perspective, but really properly engaging with staff, volunteers, beneficiaries, stakeholder communities, etc., to, as much as possible, get people on board. And that always takes longer, and it takes more work than is required. And equally, it's the kind of thing that can really scupper or a merger, or mean that it takes a lot longer to bed in. So I think that's a really important point. Yeah, I think it's hard enough for trustees who have a duty to consider the bigger picture and beneficiaries, and understand that there's sometimes a tension between the organization's best interests and the best interests of beneficiaries. That's difficult enough when you're a trustee. It's even more difficult, I think, when you're within an organization that you're seeing is suddenly going to change completely, and you fear that you might lose that culture that Chris and Sarah are both referring to.
I think there's something about patience, though, because that kind of sense of commitment, once you've started a process, the commitment to finishing it. One of those 30-year people that left us has now kind of 15 months later kind of come back to do some volunteering with us, and we are starting, I think, for those people that really did struggle with that change management, for them to start to see the real benefits, because we are bigger than the sum of our parts, and we are, as I said earlier, part of that architecture of the ICS. We sit on the executive board, so that impact around social change, you know, is starting to ripple right down, and people are starting to see that's also part of our purpose. We don't only deliver services, and I'm not saying only in the sense that that's not a huge part of what we do, but, you know, that idea of those that really take on board the fact that we fight for mental health and that is who we are, they're starting to see some real positives. So I don't want to leave it with a doomy gloomy message.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Well, I'm gonna, Tracy, I can see your hand, but I'm just going to take it slightly different direction just for a moment, because I want to bring David into the conversation. And so we started this thread with Sarah and then Clive talking about motivations and benefits for merger. And David, your situation, I think, is a different position to Sarah's, in the sense you're running a large regional organization taking on actually it's still a pretty significant organization, but a smaller organization. And I guess on the surface of it, it fits this trend that we saw in the GMI about financial distress. And I just wanted to ask you to what extent you saw your merger as being one around financial distress, or kind of stabilizing a distressed situation versus it being strategic.
I think it was a lot of all of that, Richard. To be honest, we did have a strategic ambition to grow. At the time we were a £12 million turnover hospice, which is pretty large by UK standards. But we did have a desire to grow, both organically and if possible, in a more stepped way. There's also a cosmetic desire to avoid words like rescue and takeover, and the merger tag seems to flow more easily in the charity sector, doesn't it? So we kind of knew where we were going, which was definitely to interject at a situation where a smaller hospice was financially struggling and had made some bad strategic decisions, which were exposed in the early parts of the pandemic, and actually had been a wee bit before then. So there's a wraparound really about financial need and the desire to intervene in that regard. But there's also a big part of our desire line was to have a strategic intention to move on and to grow, and not just in numbers, but also in coverage. And moving into the children's hospice arena did fit really well for us. Additionally, the children's hospice is 2 miles from where I'm sitting now, so it did make a lot of sense. And the KPIs, when you looked at the proportion of every donated pound that was actually spent in the front end care in the children's hospice, was much diminished from that which we could declare ourselves in the adult hospice. And that was quite a fundamental desire line for us. That made us pretty intent in doing it. But I guess that, as is always the situation, it's all about timing, isn't it? I mean, we were in the midst of COVID. It wouldn't have been my choice of time to begin a series of discussions about merging two organisations, but the timing is often out of your control, and just a series of circumstances make that kind of synchronicity occur, and that definitely happened. It took us 12 months. We thought it would take 6. It took us 12 months to put it all together. Lots of learnings, huge amount of learnings, things that I would do differently next time, and people that I would use differently next time as well. So there's loads of things that we've picked up from it, but frankly, it's been an amazing journey, and it's already reaping fantastic rewards for the services we deliver at the Children's Hospice. They're up and running. They were closed for a chunk of time. We retained 60 odd clinical staff. They're all very motivated, delighted to have additional resource that we were able to bring to the table. So there's a big reward quite early, which kind of surprised me, because I thought it would take a bit longer for us to really move things forward. It kind of just, at the risk of sounding cliched, I have to use the word culture. The ability for us to quite easily export our own culture to that which existed in the Children's Hospice, that made a massive difference to us as well. If we were coupling with an organisation whose culture was so different from us, then I think that would have made the journey a whole lot tougher. But actually, we could smell that there was a similarity in the culture there and here. You might think that's obvious because they're both hospices, but they are different organisations, and they had a different ethos.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, and I think culture and integration is such a big theme in trying to generate the actual benefits that you see on paper before the deal happens into reality. So I hope we're going to have time to go into more detail around that. But yeah, thank you so much. That's really interesting. And so, just to clarify, I think you said it, but just just to underline the point, it sounded like you started your discussions in COVID or during COVID times. These weren't like long-running discussions beforehand that then got catalysed later on. You started within a COVID situation.
I think Chris said earlier he was going to say something a wee bit controversial. I'm going to say that as well. I did have conversations 2 years before COVID with the hospice and was not received particularly well. So it was a revisiting for us when we went back to the table. There had been tentative conversations about sharing back office, which made a lot of sense to me. I couldn't understand why 2 hospices 2 miles apart should have 2 IT functions, 2 marketing departments, 2 finance teams, 2 fundraising teams. Didn't make any sense to me. But it did make a lot of sense to the trustee board at the Children's Hospice at the time. And I guess I would have been seen as somewhat predatory at the time. Circumstances changed. COVID changed the game. So did their financial plight. And that those jigsaw pieces came together pretty quickly in that second round of conversations. But the first round of conversations, it wasn't a popularity contest that I was winning very easily at that time.
There's been a huge shift in merging children and adult services too, though, hasn't there? So
Yeah,
that kind of, that would have perhaps, added.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's interesting. Tracy, have we got? I can see a hand up. Have we got some questions coming in that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few, but there's one I just wanted to pick up before we left the cultural question, really, I think, which was from Nikki asking about cultural fit and what are some of the best ways to test that, and is enough time spent on that versus the financial and the legal side of the. It sounds like no is the answer, but the interesting question, the latter part, but was the interesting part, I suppose, is how do you deal with that at the beginning of that process and thinking about that in those kind of early stages, I suppose.
Chris, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. David suggested it was a cliche to talk about culture, but of course it's not. It's the most critical thing. And I think you failed to address it at your peril. And I've got some scars because I've got that very badly wrong. But I was just going to give a really positive example to Tracy's question. So we did a couple of, I'm surprised they weren't in the GMI, but we did a couple of small mergers last year. One was with a CIC who actively went to market to find a partner. So they produced their own prospectus and then issued the prospectus to a number of organizations who they thought might be of interest to them. And in effect sold their wares to those organizations and asked those organizations if they were interested to submit their proposals to them. And we got involved in that process, and it was just an incredibly positive experience because the whole point around culture was that they were testing out the culture at the very beginning of the process to work out whether the organization they wanted to partner with, in effect be taken over by, was an organization they could feel comfortable with. And I have a huge respect for the board of that organization and the leadership in that organization, because to Sarah's point, they were actually putting their jobs on the line because their jobs would disappear. And they knew that, but they wanted to find a place for what they'd created. It was a spin out from the NHS. They wanted to find a good home for what they'd created. And it wasn't a financially distressed organization. It was in a decent position. But in order for it to grow, they needed a bigger platform. So it was an incredible example of a positive process where they literally wanted to make sure that their new partner was going to be culturally aligned with them. So it was a great experience.
Interesting. Anyone else want to come in from the panel on that point about testing cultures?
I think that, and I have to think very carefully, I think there was some real assumptions made actually from both trustees and kind of the 4 organisations that because they were all under the Mind banner, she says grinning, that they were going to nicely fit
I'm
together.
going to ask you about the grin. Why
A
you
lovely
grin particularly?
jigsaw. Well, like a lovely jigsaw. And I think that you just summed it up really, really well, Chris. You know, if you forget about culture, you do so at your own peril. And I think that's part of that kind of what I described earlier about hurt and loss, because I think it feels that perhaps for those 4 individual organisations, they felt really kind of there wasn't that testing work done, there wasn't necessarily that time invested. It was very much their words that we were done too. So it was looked at from a legal and financial perspective. And even though there was constant talk around, you know, improving practice, you know, increasing service, all the right management and leadership jargon, we're still dealing with kind of some of that emotional fallout. So I think that there has been some real learning for us around doing a bit more of that culture testing, or taking people with you, as you said, Clive, you know, really investing in that kind of engagement and consultation early on. So yeah.
Thank you. David, I saw a hand go up.
Yeah, I mean, I quite liked the last word on that. I definitely agree with everything Sarah and Chris have said. It was really well said. We regard ourselves as a values-driven organisation, and I guess the values we would wish to display would be similar across the 2 hospices: compassion, excellence, you know, respect, all those good things. But there's an A missing in that: care, and that's accountability. And the challenge from my trustees was, if we really believe that the culture is fittable, where's the accountability in the other organisation, and who has been accountable? So we ended up talking about that as a leadership issue, actually. And we established very quickly that the front end staff had total accountability for everything they were doing. And they were in some ways, in some terms, being misguidedly led. And there was a creation of a sense of there wasn't enough accountability. Actually, there was plenty, but it was just at the front end. And that was a really important learning for us, that the culture could easily be seen and identified at the front, at the service provision dimension of the charity, even if on the surface it seemed to be missing with some of the decisions that had been made at board level. And that was a big, big deal for us. And actually it's proven to be spot on, because the staff who are delivering fantastic care to the children and the young adults who look after it are totally accountable. And that part of the values that they have and the culture that they're identifying was never missing, really.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a follow-up question for you around this topic of culture, and I guess particularly integration. And when you're in that situation of kind of post-merger, the merger's done, you're now trying to integrate and develop the new organisation. And I guess over the years, I've seen that just approached in so many different ways. And I think the thing that I've been struck by is how different organisations approach it from a pace point of view, how quickly to do it. And I'm just really interested just to get your take on it, and just on whether you think it should be done quickly, or whether you think it should be done gradually, or, you know, kind of take the pain quickly, or done gradually over time. So any insights on that would be fascinating. I
had days where I thought things were going far too slow, and I had other days where I thought that they just weren't going fast enough. So it varies. But what I do think is you need to find allies, and you need to get people believing that there's a stake in it for them, and it isn't a top-down solution all the time. And there has to be ways in which you can find that to define your pace and almost to dictate it. So I think it's a really important matter, but I think it's something you can actually modulate. Some things absolutely necessitate quick, decisive intervention. Things need to be swift. And other things you can take your time on, and you can say, let's see how this goes. And one of the great things about the learning for us has been that the reaction when you say to somebody, do you know what, I don't really know the answer to this, so why don't we just give this a try, see how it goes, we'll have another look at it again. And we did that with branding massively for the Children's Hospice brand, which we really toiled with. We've kept it because the families love it. It's called Donna Louise. We're called Dougie Mac. Donna Louise is a very family-friendly, children-friendly brand. Did we want to get rid of it? Did we want to move it around? Did we want to recolour it? And the fact is we didn't make a quick decision, and we're still a wee bit unsure. But actually going to the staff and saying, we don't really know what we're going to do with this, but you can help us. Let's see how this goes.
Yeah.
That was very different from some of the other things we did in relation to things like fundraising and the trustee board construction and dissolving some aspects of the charity leadership, which we did very quickly. But in relation to some other stuff, it's quite good to say, not really sure what we're going to do on this. Why don't you help us work it through?
Sure.
I think I probably had a bit of an arrogance really when I arrived, because I was so excited, and I hadn't realised. Do you remember I described that kind of that journey that people had been in the 9 months before I got there? So I arrived new and full of joy and hope and happiness, and spent my first literally 3 weeks listening to staff cry, literally listening to staff cry, and that was a really valuable kind of experience for me. And I completely flipped my first 100-day plan on its head, because I'd arrived and thought that we were in a different position to what we were, and then realised the board thought we were in a different position to what we were, and there was a discord between, and I think someone talked earlier about actually the heart and the culture was sat in those buildings with the staff. It was the leadership that was struggling and had been weak. So I think it's been a very humbling experience, and as you've said, there were some real quick decisions that had to be made immediately around safety, around kind of giving staff security and containing them. And then there were other things that I'd told, and thought, I'm going to do that in 3 months or 6 months. But now, even 16 months on, we are completely revisiting kind of our values, because each of the 4 sites had similar but slightly different values. And so there's been a lot more work that we've needed to do around our kind of future strategy development. When you onboard, which I've done in years gone by as a regional manager or using project management, you arrive and you've got 100 people in front of you, and you vision and you go through this whole kind of process. And I know some of you are laughing because you'll recognise it, but it depends, doesn't it? It depends what you find. And it's, I suppose, being able to be bold and brave to say, I got that wrong, and we need to think about the people that are here in front of us. And I'm probably sharing far too much, but I'm transparent, I have no filter.
It's just how we like it. Chris, do you, just this same point about integration, I mean, you must have seen that in a number of different, you must have tried, I guess, different approaches over the years. What's your take on it?
My preference would be, pace, because, whilst you're trying to integrate, and if you take too long to integrate, that becomes quite a distraction from delivery. However, I think it's driven by how clear you are at the outset about what it is you're trying to do. And I was just reflecting on what David and Sarah was saying, and one of the mergers we did a few years ago, it's taken 4 years to actually finally integrate into the kind of wider culture of the organization. And that's because we did it in the wrong way at the beginning. And we did it in the wrong way at the beginning because we had to create an artificial device in order to drive the merger, quote unquote. Because although the trustees of the organization that was ultimately acquired saw the need for it to be acquired, they didn't want to give up on the emotional attachment to the organization that they were responsible for. And so our artificial device was to assume sole membership of the charity, which gives you the right to appoint the directors and remove the directors. But also, but unlike in sort of company law, you can't actually, you're not really the parent, even though you think you are, and you might be through some reserved matters you built into the agreement. But because we did that, we ended up with a situation where once the deal was done, that organization thought, oh, we've been saved now, we can go off and do what we want to do. And we were then saying, hey, but we want to come in and we want to get involved, and we want to kind of shape the direction as we said we would do in our kind of initial kind of proposition to you. And anyway, I mean, it's a long story, but we ended up in a position where it took us another 3 years before we actually were in a position to collapse the organization altogether and to subsume it into us. And the cost, both financially and in terms of performance, was disproportionate, really. And we should have done that at the beginning. But the reality is we wouldn't have been able to do it at the beginning because the trustee board wouldn't have gone along with it. So it's a price we had to pay.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask the panel one more question here, and then I think we'll turn to the audience questions. And I can see in the Q&A we've got a good number of questions, but just to flag to everyone, please send in some more questions now. And Tracy, if you can help us to sort through them in a moment, that would be absolutely fantastic. So I wanted just to move on to a topic about collaboration as well as merger, because I think it's already been mentioned, and we're very acutely aware, I think, that a merger is just one example of a number of different collaboration models along a spectrum. And Chris, I guess this maybe is one that you could help us with to start with. You've had a lot of experience of different types of collaboration models. Could you say a little bit more about that? And I guess what kind of, when you use different vehicles, and how you kind of go about, deciding what's a merger, what's a strategic alliance,
Well, I'm incredibly curious about how we can reach the people we want to reach, and what conduit we need to go through to get to the people we're here to support. And I have no ideological kind of further about a particular methodology. In some instances, a merger, as I said at the beginning, we're a product of a merger or an acquisition, or where we've bought an organization, or where we've entered into a strategic partnership, or we've now got an incubation program where we've grown organizations and spun them out. And recently, last year, we developed a 50-50 shareholding with a private sector organization and won a very significant DWP contract. And that's jointly owned by Catch-22 and our Australian partners, Angus Knight. So I guess I'm just interested in what road you have to go down in order to be able to do the things you want to do. And to David's point, we're ambitious to do the stuff we do. We're not ambitious because we're interested in distributing profit to shareholders. We're interested because we want to reach beneficiaries. But we won't reach as many beneficiaries if we don't kind of grow the business, and you'll end up withering on the vine. So growth is really important, and having an ambition about strategic growth has to drive the agenda that you set yourself. And then you think, well, how are we going to do this? And we can't do it in our own right. We can grow organically, but the opportunity to grow at greater pace, or as I said earlier, some of the procurement thresholds you have to cross mean that you haven't got enough capacity to carry the risk. So you need to find somebody who you can risk share with, or you might even present something as a partnership, but it ends up being a commercial relationship with the head contract sitting with a large organization, and then you're in the supply chain, but you've got some kind of memorandum of understanding which gives you some access to strategic conversations. Although I would warn people about personnel changes when that happens. So you might develop a strategic alliance with some key people, but when they move on and you're left with the commercial reality, it's a bit different. So yeah, our experience is largely driven by curiosity. What do we need to do in order to do as much as we want to do and get to the people we want to try and reach? And I'm quite, I'm always looking for an opportunity to do things. We've set up, we set up a multi-academy trust. We've done mergers. We've developed joint ventures. Yeah, a whole range of things.
It sounds like so. Function first and then form second, I think is what they say, isn't it?
I think so. I think if you get hung up on on a particular methodology, you'll just kind of get hung up on the methodology. You've just got to be agile and and go with it. But as I said at the very top of this conversation, you've also got to be prepared that somebody might come along and say to you, hey, you might be better off with us. And to David's point around the responsibility of a trustee is to think what's in the interest of this business, this organization, the long-term interest. You have to be having those conversations. And I think the big difference between our world and the private sector is that our world is driven by emotion and the private sector is driven by numbers. And if we could find a way of combining those things, we might end up with in a better place.
Great, thanks, Chris. I saw Clive's hand up and I saw David's hand up. So I think I'll go Clive first and then David.
Thanks, Richard. I raised it and then put it down because actually what I was going to say was exactly what Chris said. There's a tendency, I think, maybe to get hung up on or to get slowed down by the thought of how is this going to be structured or what are the documents that need to be put in place. And actually that is just a very secondary part of the puzzle. It's important, but the driver really is what are you looking to achieve? What are the requirements of funders or other partners? And there's always going to be then some kind of solution, and very often to every problem its own unique solution. But that really shouldn't be driving. And there's a tendency to want to think further down the line and think, oh, this is how it's going to look. But actually, that really needs to be conditioned by what your plan is and what your charitable output is going to be.
Yeah, thank you, David. Can you? I'm going to come to you, but if you can make it fairly brief, that'd be great. As what I'm going to do is then go to the audience, and I just want to make sure that we have enough time to get through everybody's questions. But yeah, if you come in and make your
point, I'll try and be punchy, Richard. I've got a very tangible evidence of a strategic alliance which works really well for us. It's with a small dementia charity. We're very serious about dementia, but we recognise the skills and the talents and the charisma that exists around this small charity. We help them, but they also help us. And it's really around them being very definitive about what they do and very clear on how that can assist us. So they're in early diagnosis of dementia. We're in palliative care of dementia patients. That's a good knitting together, a good weaving together. So there's a synergy there. The other final aspect I would say is it gave us a brilliant opportunity to recognise one of our high-flying managers, who she now effectively controls that strategic alliance. She's our head of strategic alliance. So she effectively has a career development plan based on the fact that we've not chosen to stick to a formula around mergers, but we have actually got an alliance with an organisation. It's got its own trustee board and is definitive for us. But the fantastic almost side benefit for us is we've got a really strong presence there and an individual whose loyalty to us is extreme because we've given her an incredible opportunity to run a small charity. So there's a fabulous benefit there, which you can take, I think, advantage of if you are open-minded, as Chris said, if you're not formulaic. And why would we be formulaic? Hospice care is all about tailored, not formula. So for me, organisationally, it's a great concept to be open-minded about these relationships with other organisations and respectful that other smaller organisations can do stuff that we can't do.
Interesting. Thanks, David. Great. So let's open this up. Tracy, what have we got coming through on the Q&A?
Well, an interesting one, I think, on the role of boards. So I'm quite sure the panel will have lots to say about this, but Nigel's asking about kind of the kind of principal resistance or blocks and whether this is something that should be identified in board and governance reviews. And that's kind of backed up by a question Brent's put in the chat about how often trustees and senior executives discuss conditions under which they would be willing to be taken over, to merge, to whatever. So to what extent, what's the role of the boards? How often should they be strategically looking at this? And but what's the real experience perhaps alongside that? That's the first one.
Who would like to have a crack at that first? Go on, David.
Is this a head above the parapet one?
I was going to say, you're going to be waiting to get fired now. Is that what?
We have a legitimate responsibility to look at the going concern issue every year, don't we? So we should, alongside that, be talking about whether we're delivering to our maximum or whether it could be done better in a different form. Because of our size, we would typically look at whether there's a partnership opportunity rather than just an abdication opportunity. But we do actually, at our strategy away day, first thing we do is ask ourselves whether we've achieved what we set out to and whether there's an alternative to what we're doing. So it's a little bit tangential, but it does fit in with the going concern discussion.
Thanks. So yeah, Chris.
I think as well, it depends where you are or in your kind of organisation. So we're kind of in our infancy, and it's an excuse in some ways, but also it's brilliant because you can use that to remind people that we don't have to do things how they've always done it, and you can remind boards that we all need extra training and we all need to review our efficacy as, you know, within our governance, and I think it should, could and ought to be part of, as you've just described, David, you know, business as usual discussions as such. It should be somewhere in your planning cycle for the year. I don't think it has been for us, but it is now. It's within there. So I suppose I'm admitting that it's not something that we've always done, but it is something we're doing now.
Great. What about Brent's? Just pick up Brent's question particularly there about, has anyone been, let's ask it in this way, has anyone been in a board conversation where you've considered being, or the conditions for being taken over by a larger organisation?
I think David's point around going concerns are a really important driver in this. You constantly have to think about what your business looks like going forward. And I was just going to say, so this is slight tangential, but I was going to say there are 5 dates in the Catch-22 history which I think are highly relevant. 1778, when our founders established the Philanthropic Society. 1876, when Frederick Rayner formed what ended up being the...
I hope you've got these written down and they're not ingrained in your memory.
Yeah. Formed the Rayner Foundation. 1988, the establishment of Crime Concern. 1996, the merger of the Rayner Foundation with the Royal Philanthropic Society. In 2008, that organisation merging with Crime Concern. So the point of telling you a story is, although it might not have been framed in the same language in the late 18th century, there's always been a motivation for how, you know, you're the custodians of something for a period of time. And your responsibility is to think about how you're, as trustees, their role is to protect the assets of the organisation that they're trustees of. And so therefore they need to think constantly about how they're going to maintain that organisation, and in some cases how they might arrive at the position where they say we're going to close it because our work is done, and that's another debate we don't have. You know, how many organisations just continue to exist for the sake of existing? So we shouldn't exist to just exist. We should exist to try and further our cause, to constantly evolve and develop, and therefore you have to be open to those conversations about how best can we deliver on these things. And you know, I've in 2013 we got a bit stung by the Transforming Rehabilitation competition that MOJ ran, and I was so frustrated because we ended up kind of not being able to participate in the way we wanted to because we didn't have a strong enough balance sheet. And so I was really exploring the idea of whether I could find a private sector organisation who wanted to take us in to be their charitable foundation, and that we might be able to do something. And just how could I access capital? How do you bring capital into an asset-locked organisation? And I was actively encouraged by my board to try and find those kind of solutions. And I went around my my begging hat, but I didn't actually come up with a solution. But I think if you're not having those conversations at the board level, then you're not, you're not a responsible board.
Thank you. Guys, I'm going to just keep going with some questions, just because I can see more coming through the Q&A, and I just want to make sure that as many people as possible get the chance to have their question answered. Tracy, can we?
Yeah, so the next one, which is close to my heart as well, is kind of what is the role of funders in this? Because merger costs are increasing. It's difficult for organisations that might want to get involved in this space, even if it's around partnership working, let alone merger. So is there a helpful and legitimate role of funders to suggest and encourage them? And if so, who would we be putting into our sites?
If I may, I think it's a really important part of the puzzle. And I think it's probably one of those parts of the puzzle that is currently missing, and it probably contributes to the fact that there isn't enough there isn't enough merger activity, but there's not enough of sort of exploring possibilities, because there's not the budget or the time to do it. It's something that can be done in-house if you've got the capacity. It's something that can be done by bringing in external advisors if there is the funding there to do it. But like a merger itself, it's going to take time and cost to do that, and there is insufficient funding, I think, available for that cost. Charitable foundations will be concerned mostly about the fact that this is not funding that is going directly towards delivery of charitable activities, and so it is more difficult to justify, and I think that possibly explains why there's less of it available. But I definitely agree that's one of the sort of the missing pieces in the puzzle.
Great, and Sarah, I think, had a hand up. David.
I think one of the things that we have kind of struggled with post-merger is other organisations' responses to our merger. So people's feelings that we've gone from 4 small organisations to one that now kind of dominates the mental health kind of area within a county. And I know that there has been lots of questioning around and scrutiny around what we spent on the merger, why we spent it, how we spent it, was it actually fair, was it good? I've sat in some very difficult and uncomfortable meetings where there's been some quite, I would say, Chris alluded earlier, we're an emotive, was it emotive or emotional sector, he said. So sometimes people feel they can say what they want in the middle of a meeting, and how much did that cost you, and what did you do? And I think we've had to work really hard on trying to be as transparent as possible about the cost benefit realisation of, yes, we spent that money, this was why we did it, this was our plan, and we were supported in a number of ways, but it was well thought out expenditure. And I think if this is something that anybody is considering, they do need to kind of accept that. I think charities in general over the last 2 or 3 years, have faced lots of scrutiny about where our money goes and what we do. There seems to be this general belief that, we have magic fairy dust and we can do all of the things that we do with nothing. I realise we do things on a shoestring at times, but I think for me, it will be about the transparency and being as open and honest as you can around, yes, there will be costs and this is why it's being spent and what the value of that is. I don't know if that answers that question, really.
Thank you, sir. I can see Chris's hand is up, so maybe go Chris, and then I think David, you had a hand as well. So we're going that.
I think David had his hand up first.
Oh, okay, let's do that way.
I think I just wanted to open up the question of what are reserves for, because actually charities have accumulated donations over a period of time, and it's really important that, and element of those reserves isn't just about rainy day money, it's about building for the sunshine and trying to find ways of having a development aspect to your reserves accumulation so that you are able to spend money on these initiatives. You are able to declare to your donors, this is good expenditure because we're looking to the future, and therefore we are exploring these strategic options, and it's legitimate to do that. And clearly, you know, the defence notion often of reserves definition is around just in case something bad goes wrong. Well, what about building something just in case you have an opportunity for something good to happen? So I think it's really important that reserves are defined more than just in a binary way, and they're a bit more nuanced than that, so that you can have a fund available should opportunities arise which are frankly good for the charity, good for the development of the service that you offer.
Yeah, thank you. And Chris?
I was just going to agree with David. I was just going to give a positive story. I was contacted last year by the CEO of a very large foundation who wanted to know what they could do around developing a fund for supporting consolidation in our sector. So I think there is interest out there, and our job is to excite funders about the potential benefit of consolidation.
Yeah, thanks. And let me just try and join a dot here. In the audience today viewing, we've got Max from the Association of Charitable Foundations, who you might know ACF is an organisation that's kind of the membership body for foundations. So I think now would be a good time to, if there's any pitch to how we'd like, foundations, grant foundations and trusts to potentially relate to charities that are exploring merger in the future, then now's your time to.
Well, I should say that Max actually posed the question, so I didn't name him, so clearly open to the discussion anyway. Max should be having a lot of people beating a track to the door, I suspect.
Okay, Tracy, let's take a couple more questions.
Okay, so some of these, forgive me if I don't specifically relate to them because I think some of them we have covered, but there's quite an interesting one here about, maybe this is just something the panel could give a bit of benefit from their experiences around communications. We've talked a lot about the importance of that, and there's a question here about kind of what would be the critical mass for that kind of successful communication, how you knew you would get there. But are there some tips around stakeholder mapping, structured comms to those groups, doing that early? I mean, what from your experience base makes this go well, so that we can pass on some handy tips, perhaps?
David.
Handy tips. Mine would be, Tracy, to demystify quickly and to get rid of the myths that emerge very, very quickly. All the rattle in the grapevine, you have to intervene quickly there to communicate what your objectives really are, not that which is positioned by anybody with a vested interest. So I found myself personally getting involved in a lot of demystifying, a lot of myth busting, a lot of honest conversations about what we are all about. And also I have to be honest and say, promises made early in haste can sometimes bounce back on you. So it's really important that you don't over-egg that particular pudding. But again, and finally, just stressing it, there's nothing better than face-to-face, somebody actually taking accountability for the comms so that you get a consistency there and that you do in some way combat the myths that invariably arise and the worries that arise around those myths.
Great. I've seen Clive's hand and I think Sarah had a hand. So if we go Clive and then Sarah. Clive, you've got the mute.
Sorry, I'm muted. After 2 years, you'd think I'd learned. From the legal point of view, I suppose there will be some types of decisions that will require you to achieve a certain level of consent. If there's going to be an amendment to your Articles of Association or your Constitution, for example, you will need at least 75% of people at an AGM if that's the decision-making forum. I think you're setting yourself up for trouble if you're aiming to just hit that 75% and not exceed it. So you certainly need to get beyond that when for example, you need member consent. I think also I completely agree with David being on the front foot on communication, being able to shape the narrative, get in there with your message before the myths or fear sets in. And again, from a procedural point, there may be consents that we need to get from funders, landlords, charity commission, other regulators. And that we would always say, get in touch with those regulators that you can't make things happen without as soon as possible. So you've got those stakeholder consents in your pocket. And that then sort of makes the whole mechanical process of the merger or the other form of collaboration easier.
Thank you. And Sarah?
Yeah, just really following up from David's point about kind of being available and demystifying. I think one of the things that we learned from was perhaps we were very inwardly facing. Now, our process did start at the beginning of a pandemic, and our waiting lists blew up. So I think perhaps we didn't do enough, perhaps with some of our external stakeholders. So I think it's being aware of everybody that you need to be communicating with, even if you think you've got it right, just, yeah, check and balance around that, really.
Great, thank you. Tracy, I think we're coming to that point. We've probably got time for one more question.
Okay. Yeah. There's one more here around, which kind of actually Sarah touched on interestingly earlier. How do we think the push for community engagement and the drive to involve community coming through the integrated care systems will affect M&A activity? And does this mean that larger charities need to protect the local identity of smaller community-based organisations? Will it be harder to gain efficiencies from such mergers if you need to maintain a more senior presence to maintain community links after the merger has happened? So I think it's really what's that situation? Is that creating a pull through, particularly in the health and social care sectors? Any thoughts?
Chris, head us off.
I'm really excited by the idea of unlocking capacity in communities to reorganise the way we deliver public services. And I think there is a very significant responsibility on organisations with some scale to act as a kind of an integrator to unlock that capability without squashing it or being predatory and looking after its own interests. So if you start from the position of what's right for the people you're there to support, you end up building a structure which is designed to meet the needs. So I've long been banging on about how you could reorganize public services so that they become much more relational, much more local, much more accountable to the people who are using them. And to the point where if you could engage the people who are using them in running them, then you're more likely to achieve better outcomes. And so how do you organize that? How do we organize ourselves at the most appropriate level to effectively deliver those kind of services? And that means we need to get health commissioners, local authorities, PCCs, the whole raft of commissioners to think very differently about who provides public services, and that the default producer isn't necessarily the state.
Great, thank you. And Sarah.
David, you were super keen. Did you want to go first?
Sarah, you go first.
Okay, so I think just following up from what you're saying there, Chris, I would say that the biggest benefit of our merger has been the ability to kind of, influence and sit within the architecture of the ICS. So Northamptonshire Mind is on that kind of executive collaborative board for mental health, learning disabilities and autism. We would not have been invited around that table. However, with that, as you described, comes that responsibility that we have established, or because we have the capacity now, we've established a voluntary sector assembly. So when I go and sit within those kinds of, pillar meetings, executive meetings, collaborative meetings with public health, local authorities and kind of NHFT, I know that I am representing 70 odd other charities that want to be providing services. And so I think the ICS, I mean, I get so excited. I've done a number of keynote speaks about how we need to really kind of see the value. It's the biggest, you know, change in social policy since the last war. And for any of us that have studied over the last 20 years, we've all waited for it. We all knew it was coming. But actually, I know in Northamptonshire, we are a front runner with the ICS. So I suppose I'm starting to really see it now on the ground and impact on kind of genuine co-production. And we are seeing millions flowing through the ICS into the third sector. So there's something about, although there was some resistance to our merger, there is now an understanding that our integrity is really important and that desire to collaborate is genuine, and that the service users need to be at the heart of what we do. So, yeah.
Thank you. And David.
Yeah, well said. Completely concur with Sarah's sentiments and Chris's optimism. I have that optimism too. I really want it not to be a moving around of the furniture. I do want it to be a culture shift. Yeah. I want to change the dynamics. I'm a £15 million organisation, only 3 million is coming from statutory funding. So why should a 50-year-old hospice be dependent on cake sales and charity shops? Isn't it time that we readdressed the palliative care option in North Staffordshire so that the bulk of that funding is much more stabilised? That will be the acid test of the ICS. Can you take a 50-year-old hospice seriously enough to modify its funding model away from massive dependency on charitable support? And can you do that in a way that doesn't compromise our independence? I think you can. I do think you can. But I think it takes a bit of bravery that little evidence so far is obvious to me. But I absolutely think this is a one-off opportunity to shift the game plan. It really is. And we're waiting to see a little bit more in North Staffordshire than you are in Northamptonshire about just how much muscle we're going to have in those conversations. But I don't see any reason why we couldn't be at the apex of that. And it isn't about the public sector automatically gets the first throw of that particular catch. You know, I think it should be driven by who's best placed to maximise the service.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think it's incumbent on us to stop allowing the commissioners to patronise the sector in which we're operating. So we've got to be much more confident about what it is we can do. Yeah, sorry.
Thanks. No, it's great, Chris. And, you know, I share.
We need a whole nother workshop now on the ICS and the opportunity.
Yep. Yeah, well, exactly. It's a big thing, and it's important that we're all on top of it. But I'm afraid that we're also at that moment where we have to say that all good things need to come to an end, and it's been a blast. So I'm going to take the prerogative and give our fab panel the chance to just make one last comment, and it could be a tip for someone else who's viewing this, who may be about to go through a merger or explore it, or it could be something that you've found, you know, particularly of interest today that you wanted to emphasise. So I'm going to go around. I think Clive, if it's okay, I'll start with you, and then go Clive, Chris, David, and Sarah.
Thanks. I mean, I'm always energised by these discussions, and I think the optimism and the sort of the energy shines through from these discussions on a sort of practical hints and tips for the merger. I think the big one that stands out for me is making sure that there is complete alignment between board and senior leadership team, that there is clarity of purpose and sort of strong communication channels between the two, and sort of constant two-way support, because it's not gonna work otherwise, and there needs to be that alignment, and to the extent that you're able to rely on advisors, use them well, use their skills, and make sure that they are all coordinating between them, because there's so many angles to cover off, that communication and coordination is key. And then maybe just on that point that Sarah made, be realistic about the time and the cost that it's, and unfortunately the pain that may arise during the process.
Chris, please.
Thanks, Richard. Well, I suppose I just want to end on the point we've just been talking about, really, about the capability of our sector. But I want to frame it within a kind of, it's a bit trite, but I just want to say that our sector doesn't have a monopoly on compassion. The private sector doesn't have a monopoly on efficiency, and the public sector doesn't have a monopoly on integrity. But together, we can find a way of reaching the people we're here to support and making a difference to people's lives. And so linking it back to the purpose of the GMI, I think if you start from the position of what's right for beneficiaries, you end up with the right answer.
Thank you. David.
Yeah, listen, I don't think I can beat that. I think Chris has beautifully articulated a really, really vital point there. So maybe I would just encapsulate it by saying, let's not hide a fantastic light under a bushel. Let's get out there and show what we can do, because I think working in a charity is a massive privilege, and I feel that way about my job in the hospice. We do some brilliant things, and we just need to trumpet it more and more. And thank you for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it.
Great pleasure. And Sarah, you've got the last word.
Well, Chris, haven't I? I think, you know, all that's jumped into my head now is my nan when I was a little girl telling me that fortune favours the brave. I think sometimes you have to have difficult conversations. You have to be willing to go to those, you know, go into those conversations with an open mind. And I would say that a lot of what we've been discussing today is around attitude and aptitude. A lot of it is around kind of the attitude of the people in the room, whether that's to risk, whether that's to growth, whether that's to kind of, you know, future planning as a whole. But I think it is having those conversations and being, you know, in a space where you make the time to do that.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and look, thank you, panel. You know, you've been a fab panel. We've had a blast. I hope we can do it again sometime. And thank you everybody for watching and listening. Tracy, can I hand back to you to wrap us up?
Of course, yes. No, so a huge thank you. Just to add mine to all the work that went into this before you all appeared, and for the time that you gave us in the preparation. So thank you so much, panel. If you want to continue the conversation, we run merger round tables every quarter, and they're a slightly more select group and a smaller group, not a select group, a smaller group, a more intimate group who kind of chief executives, normally senior leaders, who get together to discuss merger in more detail. If you're on our mailing list, you'll hear about these things. If you're not, then drop me a line and I'll happily book you into one of those. And obviously always happy to have individual discussions, because we're very keen to learn and to hear about best practice so that we can kind of share that out through our work. And so I'm always up for a chat. So my contact details are there, and I'd love to speak to you. But thank you again. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you to the panel. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Mike. And we'll wrap it up there. Have a very good afternoon.